Russians are turning against Putin. His so-called special military operation has become a humiliating mess. What was supposed to last 2 weeks was dragged on for over 2 years, with Putin failing at every turn. Now it's not just NATO-backed Ukraine he's struggling against, his own people are refusing to fight his wars. Let's break down how Putin's incompetence is driving his soldiers and citizens to revolt. We'll start with the most common major event that's possibly turned the tide of the entire war: Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. This is a significant shift in the war's tenuous dynamic between the two sides. For 30 months, Russia was the obvious aggressor, pushing further and deeper into Ukraine. Ukrainians were spread thin, trying to defend their lands and push the Russians back. While the first wave of attacks, the ones that managed to nearly make it into the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, were ultimately repelled by the end of 2022, that didn't stop Putin from maintaining his war rhetoric and strategy. Before the Kursk invasion, Putin's goals were simple: take as much of Ukraine as possible, and as fast as possible, and by any means necessary. And the rhetoric spouted by the Kremlin's news reports worked in Putin's favor. The citizens were assured that the Ukrainians were to blame for all the minute reasons behind the special military operation, and that the Russian army would soon quell them and return Russia to peace. Of course, those reports only worked because of how Russia carefully managed to spin the narrative. Kremlin divided the Russian people into two groups: urbanites who lived in Moscow and other major cities far away from war and with nothing to fear, and the rural population, who was at the Kremlin's beck and call with multiple rounds of conscriptions and lucrative enlistment contracts, but we'll get around to those later. What the Kursk invasion changed is that Russia suddenly became the defender. Ukraine stepped over the boundary that divided the two countries and invaded one of Russia's regions, one that turned out to be woefully defended by Russian forces. The entire invasion seemed more like a fever dream than an actual military campaign. When it started, the Ukrainian government and its army was silent. There were no news reports to determine whether the invasion was successful and what exactly the goal of that strategy was in the first place. The first reports came from the Kremlin. They touted that the Ukrainian army crossed the border with a paltry 100 troops and a few military vehicles in what they thought was a desperate attempt to divert Russian forces from the real front, the ongoing fighting in the Ukrainian Donetsk region. The Russian authorities claimed that they would push back the Ukrainian invaders quickly and that the Russian forces stationed in Kursk were more than capable of doing so. A few days later, the reports from Russia became more dubious. The invasion seemed to not only have continued but progressed. Before long, Ukraine managed to take over control of dozens of villages and towns in the Kursk region. So what happened to elicit this change? The answer is rather simple: conscripts. Rather than using professional, contractually obligated soldiers to man the defensive positions in Kursk, the military was using fresh conscripts to fill those spots. The same was probably true for many other regions neighboring Ukraine, but Kursk was just the one where the effects were obvious. The conscripts in Kursk turned out to be no match for the invading Ukrainian forces, which over the first week of the invasion grew in number and obtained more artillery support. Over the few weeks of news coverage concerning the events in Kursk, there were more than a few videos showing Russian soldiers simply surrendering to the advancing Ukrainians. According to the report issued by the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, the Ukrainian army captured close to 600 Russian soldiers, who then became prisoners of war and were transported to Ukrainian prisons. In an early report from one of the prisons responsible for housing the POWs, it was suggested that roughly 80% of the soldiers in Kursk were conscripts. But why is that so terrible for the Russian army? Well, to answer that, we need to delve a bit deeper into how the Russian army functions, or more precisely, how Russia gets more soldiers. Unlike the US and many other countries around the world where enlisting in military service is entirely voluntary, the Russian army has a two-pronged enlistment process. First, there are contract soldiers, known as kontraktniki, who sign a 3-year contract in the Russian army, but then are generally encouraged to sign multiple, consecutive contracts to prolong their service. The second method is conscription. Before the Russo-Ukrainian War, every Russian male between 18 and 27 years of age was required to register with the Russian military. Out of that group, a specific number of registrants would be called to join the military every 6 months to serve as conscripts for 1 year. Originally, the mandatory military service period was 2 years, but was subsequently reduced, but we'll go over the reasoning for that a bit later. While Russia maintained a generally small population of conscripts, given that they were constantly replaced with fresh recruits, the war in Ukraine changed that significantly. Over the course of the war, it's estimated that the Russian military has been conscripting at a rate of roughly 130,000 soldiers every 6 months. In July 2023, the upper age limit for the draft was raised from 27 to 30, allowing Russia to pull from an even larger pool of Russian men to conscript into the army. As a result, Russia has been relying more and more on its stock of conscripts, rather than using contract soldiers. But where's the difference, you might ask? First, contract soldiers are paid for being in the military, and quite handsomely so. During the war, the Russian government has dangled contracts that pay out as much as 3 or 4 times the average salary. This has been particularly noticeable in the more rural regions of the country, which has resulted in the significantly lopsided demographics of the Russian military as of late. According to some sources, a Muscovite is over 50 times less likely to die in the war than a person belonging to a minority from Siberia. This trend shows that Russia is counting on people being desperate to earn a living wage and willing to sign up for 2 years of service in the military. Regardless, that doesn't quite solve the problem with conscription, since mandatory military service this way is largely unpaid. No, the major difference between contract soldiers and conscripts is in how they're treated in the army and the general structure of the Russian military. You see, unlike the US, which has 5 basic training locations for all recruits, the Russian military training is much more decentralized. Recruits are immediately assigned units, and each unit is responsible for conducting training according to the agreed-upon standards. However, this decentralization has led to many officers skirting the training regimes they enforce, creating a large variance in experience and training between each unit. Furthermore, since the conscripts are only meant to serve for 1 year, they typically don't receive the same amount or quality of training that the contract soldiers do. Usually, conscripts don't partake in many battle simulations, and their roles in the military are largely supportive, such as cleaning, cooking, or driving. If they're attached to squads, they typically have administrative or perfunctory roles, such as ceremonies or tending to military equipment. That's led to a somewhat disparaging view of conscripts throughout the Russian military, making them seem like the army's last resort and the bottom rung of the military. This is compounded by the fact that the Russian military legally can't deploy conscripts on missions abroad. Even if they were meant to be combat ready, their role in the army is to defend Russia against foreign attacks rather than lead the charge. What all this meant is that even at the height of the Russo-Ukrainian War, there was somewhat of an understanding that conscripts wouldn't be anywhere near the front lines, which is currently deep inside Ukrainian territory. But that all changed with the Kursk invasion. Suddenly, Ukraine became the attacker on Russian soil, and the conscripts were thrust into the heat of battle, as unprepared and under-equipped as they ever were. With all the previous points in mind, it's quite clear to see exactly why there has been a wave of surrenders in Kursk, and why the Russian military has failed to mount a significant defense in the region. With the floodgates to Russian territory open, Putin now has all the means and motive to actually send conscripts to defend Russia, and that's a particularly dangerous precedent, considering what happened to conscripts in previous campaigns. For that, we'll need to go back further into history, when the Soviet Union still existed. During Soviet times, the Russian army had several million conscripted soldiers, making it one of the largest conscripted armies in the world. Unlike today, these conscripts could be readily mobilized for any conflict. They ended up being deployed to fight in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, the war ended up being one of the final nails in the coffin for the Soviet Union, but not without significant casualties. By the time the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, it was estimated to have lost 15,000 soldiers. While this number is insignificant compared to the casualties in the current war, the deaths of these mostly conscripted soldiers led to stern discontent with the Soviet regime and public institutions. The soldiers who survived the war were quickly forgotten amid the sweeping changes brought on by the fall of the Soviet Union, and sought to extend their military careers elsewhere. When Putin came to power, the Afghan veterans were brought back into the fold and awarded for their bravery and contribution to the country. Those same veterans became fervent supporters of Putin's regime, and perhaps a part of the reason the military was so ready to conduct offensive operations abroad. But for the average conscript, life would only get worse. After the war in Afghanistan came the first Chechen War in the mid-90s, leading to yet another estimated 10,000 deaths on the Russian side. As Russia considered Chechnya a Soviet republic and one close to reuniting with the Federation, it sent conscripts to fight in what would be a bloody civil war that led to as many as 100,000 civilian deaths, with 500,000 people displaced from the country. The protests against the regime began anew, and the public opinion on sending conscripts to war reached its lowest point. It was the war in Chechnya that ultimately caused the Russian Federation to sign the law preventing the deployment of conscripts abroad, yet the country still retained the draft. As a result, while Russia technically had compulsory military service, many families were trying their best to have young men avoid it as much as possible. Illnesses were invented and corroborated, and men were sent to higher education institutions. One of the ways to avoid the service was to be an active student. As Ian Garner, a historian focusing on Russian war history, explains, draft dodging is practically an art form in Russia. When the war between Russia and Ukraine escalated from a blitzkrieg to an attrition-based conflict, and Putin announced the first round of conscriptions, many Russians redoubled their efforts to avoid being called into service. As many as 900,000 people left the country by the end of 2022. Not all of them were service-capable men, but those men took their entire families and lives with them to get away from the Russian military. And now, with Ukraine in Russia's territory, the conscripts can again be called upon to the front lines, this time against an army that's much more experienced and determined to win. So it's no wonder that the scattered soldiers inside Kursk have been rapidly surrendering to incoming Ukrainians. They didn't really stand a chance. And if Ukraine decides to push its advantage, the same thing can happen to other nearby regions, spreading discontent among both the soldiers and the civilian population about Putin's actions in the war. The Kursk incursion also showed that Putin doesn't mind if hundreds of people need to be displaced from their homes. As current estimates suggest, there were roughly 200,000 people in the Ukraine-occupied regions of Kursk. Throughout all that, Russia is still giving far more attention to contract soldiers. While conscripts can technically sign a contract, they can only do so after their first year of military service. Considering the scale of the Russo-Ukrainian war, this means that a lot of the conscripts might not even get to see the end of their first year of service. All the promises of glory, heroism, and monetary compensation are firmly directed toward the contract soldiers, who are on the front lines, fighting to gain a mile of land in Donetsk while being pelted by NATO-supplied ammunition. When the conscripts captured in Kursk were interviewed, most suggested they didn't expect to see actual combat. They were given minimal training and equipment in order to stand their ground. Some military bloggers even suggested that the newest batches have undergone only a week of military training. This is not nearly enough to prepare a person to function in the military, let alone be on the battlefield. According to Russian policies, conscripts should be trained for 1 to 2 months and then get an additional 3 to 6 months of training to be considered ready to serve. In the US, the initial boot camp lasts 10 weeks and is followed by at least 22 weeks of advanced training. Compared to that, a week or two is practically nothing. The Kremlin is aware of the discrepancy in how it treats conscripts and contractnikis, and has so far worked to get ahead of any damning reports to cover them up. While the Ukrainians were sweeping through the farmlands of Kursk with Russian conscripts surrendering in their wake, the officers were celebrating the official Officers' Day. The reports from the Kursk region still show a lack of proper military response from Russia. Zelensky has noted that Ukraine intends to keep the region occupied for as long as possible, giving it another chip to put on the negotiating table. In the meantime, Putin has been trying, and failing, to sweep the very existence of the Kursk invasion under the rug. But conscripts are not the only group Putin needs to be worried about. Some people much closer to Moscow, who can pull significant strings, have also started to doubt the Russian president's capability to lead the country. We're talking about the Russian oligarchs. These men and women, but mostly men, mainly got rich by Russia's prodigious expanse in the energy sector, particularly the oil and gas industries. The old oligarchs got their wealth in the 90s, when the government reforms caused significant industry changes, allowing the few to get rich off the switch from socialism to capitalism in what would be modern Russia. Putin largely tried to replace the old oligarchs, who criticized him when he came to power, albeit not as successfully. After a few were imprisoned, the remainder struck a deal with Putin to lose a part of their wealth and power, but remain in the Russian president's good graces and continue to benefit. But this only worked so long as the country's energy sector kept prospering. The Kremlin needed the oligarchs, who have developed extensive ties with prominent Western companies, as much as the oligarchs needed Putin, who could bail out failing companies via the state bank. The war in Ukraine turned the situation on its head. Practically overnight, Russia had lost some of its largest trading partners and had to scramble to sign trade deals with China and India to make up for the losses. The deals with China were arguably much less lucrative than those with Europe, but they were practically the only way to keep the country running during wartime. During 2023, the trade with China reached its peak at $240 billion and is now showing a slight decline. At the beginning of the war, when it was still uncertain how long it would take, the oligarchs remained silent on the matter, still looking to see the economic implications of the invasion. But when the first signs of trouble started, some chose to make a more public stance against the war. One such oligarch is Oleg Tinkov, who renounced his Russian citizenship in 2022 and called the Russian supporters morons. Tinkov is likely the first in many dominoes to crumble around Putin. Other oligarchs merely resorted to token criticism and grumbling, such as Mikhail Fridman, who co-founded Russia's largest private bank. Fridman returned to Russia when the conflict between Israel and Hamas broke out, showing that Putin still holds some reins in how oligarchs can operate. Putin has used the war as an opportunity to further curb the influence the oligarchs have on his regime. One example is the recent lawsuit to nationalize a company owned by one of Russia's richest men, Andrei Melnichenko. With Russia under extensive sanctions from the West, many companies owned by oligarchs such as Melnichenko no longer have the same economic connections they had before the war. It makes them surprisingly easy pickings for the Russian state to control them and people who own them as a result. But the oligarchs are probably in on the scheme as well. Remember when we discussed that many of them got rich in the energy sector? Well, that sector is not looking so good right now. Repeated Ukrainian strikes on key refineries have caused widespread deficits in refined oil and gas. This is primarily due to Russia using the just-in-time delivery approach, keeping very little oil in reserve despite being one of the world's largest producers of it. This means that a sudden drop in production, such as a refinery in Western Russia being bombed to oblivion, can disrupt the flow of these precious resources. This affects both trade and the internal economy. In fact, Russia has lost nearly 15% of its oil refining capacity over the previous year, which has ultimately caused the government to stop exporting fuel to all but 4 former Soviet countries until the end of 2024, with some analysts suggesting that the ban will persist through 2025. Additionally, Russia has asked Kazakhstan to create a reserve of 100,000 tons of gasoline that can be supplied to Russia on short notice. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Russian oligarchs have really lost much throughout the war. Bloomberg published a list of a dozen companies that collectively gained more than $11 billion in 2023 alone through dividend payments, so the money still kept flowing into the oligarchs' pockets, even if there was a little bit less of it from other sources. However, Putin's attempts to dismantle some of the biggest earners and the fact that the oil and gas trade is starting to directly get hit by Ukrainian attacks create a dangerous precedent for the oligarchs who operate in the sector. As the energy sector is responsible for roughly 20% of the country's GDP, consistent trade deal cancellations and export bans are bound to create long-term deficits. Western sanctions also limit how much coverage the oligarchs have under Putin. With the connections they fostered severed by sanctions, Putin may find the old stock of oligarchs useless in maintaining the facade of universal support in the country. To make matters worse for Putin, Ukraine has started to ramp up its offensive, which can further alienate oligarchs and the middle class alike. On September 10, 2024, Ukraine launched its biggest and most ambitious drone strike yet. Over 140 drones were deployed to strike deep into Russian territory. The attack is the second of its kind, following the earlier August 21st strike, with 45 drones. The main target, Moscow itself. While the initial strike in August was fully intercepted by Russian anti-air defenses, the September strike killed at least one person and wrecked dozens of homes in the urban center of Russia. The ensuing chaos diverted 50 flights coming into Moscow. This is the first instance of Ukraine hitting the Russian capital and is likely a portent of attacks to come. With these drone strikes, Ukraine has sent a clear message to Putin: Russia is no longer safe. The attacks can resonate deeply within the Moscow communities, which have so far been largely unaffected by the war itself. When combined with Ukraine managing to get hold of more Russian territory in a month than Russia's offensive has done over the previous 7, the attack set a dangerous precedent for Putin. The Kremlin might no longer be able to sweep the truth about the war under the rug. And if the conscription issues continue, Russia may need to tap into a resource it hasn't used in a while: the middle and upper classes of large cities. Somewhat surprisingly, this presents yet another attack on Russian oligarchs. While they could stand to watch the action unfold from the sidelines and rake in the money, the wealthy Russians are now truly in a pinch. Their companies are under threat of being seized by the government, their cash flows are being squeezed by the export bans, and their children might be called upon to die for Putin's fragile ego. Even the newer wave of Russia's elite is starting to feel the pain. Since the energy sector has been booming for a while, it's caused a chain reaction of other sectors falling behind. China has swept in to take the reins and create near monopolies for consumer goods ranging from smartphones to cars to agricultural equipment. With domestic manufacturing under attack, there's little reason to stay in business if it's cheaper to buy from abroad. As such, Putin is on a collision course with the very same people who have supported his stranglehold on Russian politics. If he decides to make an overtly aggressive move, the oligarchs might become desperate enough to remove him from the seat permanently. Ultimately, Putin is on the verge of losing support from practically all of Russia's citizens, at least the ones who can directly impact the war in Ukraine. If one of those dominoes starts falling, Putin will likely have to double down on the war in Ukraine to close it out before it's too late. On paper, Russia still has the resources to outlast Ukraine in a war of attrition. After all, despite accruing nearly 700,000 troop casualties over the past 30 months, Ukraine has lost nearly 500,000 soldiers itself, and Russia has twice the population to throw at the meat grinder. However, Ukraine's moving into Russian territory has renewed Western support, with the US announcing more aid packages before the end of the year. Additionally, despite long-standing saber-rattling, Russia's threats of deploying nuclear weapons against NATO have turned out to be empty so far. The alliance can be emboldened to send more advanced military equipment to Ukraine, some of which were blocked by the very same nuclear threats. The first batch of 65 F-16 fighter jets has already taken flight in the skies above Ukraine, and Zelensky now might have just enough leverage to ask for more. If Putin doesn't end the war soon, someone else will end the war for him, and it's unlikely to be in his favor. But what do you think? How long will the war continue, and will Putin remain Russia's president afterward? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out how Ukraine's invasion turned Russian civilians against Putin, or click this other video instead.